Hello everybody and welcome to the MerwinMusic YouTube channel. In this video we're going to repair this old mystery guitar amp. Okay, so about a year and a half ago, my friend Gary, who is the drummer at my church, asked if I wanted this amplifier. I guess one of his friends left it at his house years ago and didn't want it back, so he asked me if I wanted it. So if you're watching this, thanks Gary for the amp. Now when he gave it to me, he said he didn't think it worked and he thought that the previous guy had just used it as a speaker cabinet. So when I got it, I opened it up to have a look around and I saw that there was no speaker in it at all. So it must not have been very loud. But this amp looks like something that is cool enough to get working again. Now the biggest hurdle with this amp is that it appears to be just something that somebody made. So you can see that the faceplate says Showman amp, but this is definitely not a Fender Showman. And on closer inspection, the faceplate looks hand-drawn, and a lot of the holes are kind of sloppy like they were drilled by hand. So since this amp is kind of an oddball, we obviously don't have a schematic, and we are kind of on our own when it comes to repairing it. Now it looks like a pretty standard dual 6L6 power amp with bias modulating tremolo. Now if anybody thinks they know what this amp could be a clone of, let me know in the comments. I just worked off of schematics for a Fender Bandmaster and a Vibro Verb. Now the first thing I did was install a 3-prong power cord on the amp, and I put that in a separate video, so if you want to check that out, check out that video. Alright, taking a look at the tubes first to see if those are still good. Now it has these Toshiba power tubes in it, but as you can see these are pretty burned and they actually ended up being no good. So I ended up having to replace those with a new pair of electro harmonix 6L6s. Next I tested the preamp tubes and they all ended up testing good for continuity between pins 4, 5, and 9. Okay. But I found out later that most of them were super microphonic, so I had to replace a lot of those as well. Okay, so I've gone ahead and flipped the amp over now, and I'm going to check this big capacitor over here, simply because it is going to be easy to pull out of circuit. And sure enough, it is dead, so I'm going to go ahead and replace all of the filter capacitors right off of the bat. Next I looked around the amp and I saw that this one potentiometer here just spins and spins and is clearly broken. So I'm going to go ahead and replace that. And while I'm over here, it looks like there is this wire that never got soldered up. It's just sitting there wrapped around the terminal. So I'm going to go ahead and solder that. Alright, so we took care of some preliminary problems, and I think now it is time to fire up the amp and see how it is.
So with those changes done here. Working. If I turn the tremolo up, that beautiful noise.
Alright, so the tremolo works, it just has some extra noise in it, so let's see what we can do about that. So looking at the tremolo circuit, I suspected that the electrolytic capacitor tied to ground here was bad, and sure enough it pulled it out of the amp, and the resistor and the cap were both bad. So I'm going to go ahead and replace all of those now. Okay, well the good news is I got these new caps in here and the amp is basically working. So I'm gonna go ahead and focus on some of the cosmetics here. So I'm going to loosen all these jacks and pots and pull this faceplate off. Now you can see it has a nice warp to it, but once it's off of the amp, I can just bend it back flat by hand. And then I'm going to clean this carefully so I don't scrape off any of the paint. Okay, so I got the faceplate back on the amp, and I ended up spraying it with some clear coat to keep the paint from scraping off any worse. And I've gone ahead and put on these new knobs. Now the old knobs I really didn't like, and what kind of sealed the deal to not reuse them was if you turned them just right, they actually ran into each other with these little points, which is pretty ridiculous. So I first had the thought of maybe doing some Fender Blackface style knobs. This faceplate kind of emulates that anyways, so I figured it would kind of look Fender Blackfacey. But they actually wrote out the numbers on the amp here, which is not normal for a Fender. So those knobs ended up looking kind of weird, and they're pretty big, and they actually hide the labels here. So then I found these guitar pedal style knobs, and I think that looks pretty good. So I went ahead and just put all of those onto the amp. And at this point, this amp is getting really close here. So all I have to do is check the bias, which should be pretty easy since it has a bias setting knob here. So it's just a matter of checking some voltages while I turn this knob, and then we'll see how this amp sounds. Well, there you go. Thanks for tuning in. As you can hopefully hear, this amp sounds great. I could not be happier with it. There's just one last thing I need to do, which is either put this back in the cabinet that it came with and track down a speaker to finish this off, or I'm actually thinking I might build a box and turn this into an amp head. So if that's a project you'd be interested in seeing in the future, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe and not miss out on any of my future videos. But most of all, thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.